Hello and welcome. This is Dan Hall, the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, with my broadcast partner, Dave Jinks. Hi, Dave. How
Hi,
are you doing?
Dan.
Tonight, on Anomalies, we're going to attempt to do something we haven't done. Most of the shows that we have done in the past have been about, well, let's see, how would you characterize them? They haven't been political. They've been just kind of supernatural, paranormal. Tonight's topic, though, is highly political. And I guess this is just a choice of ours to diverge a little bit. We're going to talk about something that is horrific, but it's not horrific in the sense that some of the paranormal topics we've talked about have been horrific. We're going to talk about the events of 9/11, and this is going to be, without a doubt, kind of controversial. I've always been bothered by the events of that day and what we've been told by them. So in tonight's show, I think what we're going to try to do here is maybe not necessarily answer the question, well, what really did happen on 9/11, which supposes that the official version we were told was not accurate. But I think we are going to address some questions that make 9/11 and what we were told to be in severe doubt. So, Dave, is that your kind of perspective about what we're going to do?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, and I would say out of all the topics that we've discussed, personally, I am more convinced that we're right on this one than I am on almost anything else we've talked about. I mean, we've discussed a wide variety of conspiratorial subjects, from UFOs to Bigfoot to crop circles to psychic phenomena.
What's going to happen in 2012? All
Right,
kinds of
2012. We covered the whole range there, and this one I think is as close to an open and shut case as I've run across as far as these sort of controversial subjects here. So I wanted to ask what everyone has a 9/11 moment. And I wanted to know what what you were doing when you discovered what was happening. What was your initial reaction on that fateful day? I'm just curious because I don't think we've talked about that before, Dan. So what were you doing?
I thought a lot about that too. I thought that was kind of maybe a good starting point. What I remember about that day is this was early in the morning before I went to work. I was out with my wife, Michelle, and we were walking our dogs around a park. And, just the usual morning thing where you're kind of half awake and the dogs are pulling you along, whatever. Mm-hmm. And we happened to come across a lady, and I forget her name now, that we oftentimes ran into on the dog walk. And she said to us, "Did you see what's going on?" And I remember Michelle and I, we haven't. And she said, "Well, it's horrible." And she said, "Someone has crashed." I forget her exact words. Something to the effect that someone has crashed a plane or some plane into the World Trade Center, and it's on TV. It's just horrific. And my reaction, I can't remember exactly what Michelle said, but my reaction was in a way, but also typical of me. And it was like, well, that's not very shocking to me. It's like I expected something like that to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's not like, oh, I can't imagine anybody doing that. I could imagine somebody. But one of the things I've kind of focused on about that is, and then I'd like to hear what your thought was, that it was kind of indelibly printed in my mind that all I knew about that day and what had happened was what I was told. Mm-hmm. I didn't have any intrinsic knowledge. Mm-hmm. I had somebody have to tell me or interpret what happened. What do you remember?
Well, of course, for this, all of us who were alive at that moment, that horrifying moment, will be our moon landing. Well, see, I was born in 1969, so I wasn't quite aware of the moon landing. You probably remember what you were doing when we landed on the moon, the time of the Kennedy assassination, other benchmarks, landmarks, in the course of human history. And of course, 9/11 will be one of the most horrific, and I think anyone who was alive at that time will remember what they were doing, as long as they were old enough to have it imprinted. But, I don't know why. I'm not usually up that early. Wasn't it around 6:30 Pacific time somewhere? For some reason, I was up. And I think my reaction was to cry, actually, to get tears welled up in my eyes as I watched what happened. But I only thought of one phrase, and that's all I remember now thinking, and that was World War III. That was it. That was the beginning. And other than that, I didn't really have an impression, but I think that's my nature, is not to make a judgment about what's going on until I get more facts. But I certainly did think this is the beginning of World War III. And like you said, it was really highly controlled how it was delivered to the public. And was it the same day or within 24 hours that it was, quote, confirmed that Osama bin Laden was the perpetrator. And we pretty much had the story fully formed within a day or two. And we as the American public and the rest of the world were sort of being funneled into one viewpoint about the event or the events. And like many things that are sort of managed through the top 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 networks, which are all basically owned by the same companies, media companies, a small handful of media companies, we were fed a narrative that built upon itself. Obviously, in the first 24 hours, there was really chaos. There were a lot of different reports, a lot of really interesting bits of information that, in the end, were either ignored or filtered out or disregarded as irrelevant. And naturally, some of those key data points are, as it turns out, very important to understanding what really happened. But that's the nature of TV news, is to start the narrative forming and stick with it. And that's kind of what we've done for now, 12 years.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about that narrative because one interesting aspect of this whole thing is the questions that are raised by the narrative, maybe how quickly it was developed. That narrative was then used as kind of an outcome to essentially be the basis for an invasion of Iraq, with the idea that somehow Saddam Hussein and the culprit of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, were in cahoots to harm the United States. And of course we kind of know there's an unfolding truth about that narrative, and that possibly that narrative wasn't accurate. That Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, although nefarious in their own right, were not linked in any way, shape, or form, and that some of the things we were told about what the capabilities of Saddam Hussein to pose a threat to the United States weren't accurate. But it all kind of starts in a way with this event on 9/11, leads us to present day. What are the reasons that you think that this narrative should be questioned? And when I say this narrative, I think what we're talking about is the 9/11 Commission, that was a hodgepodge of politicians, Democrats and Republicans, who got together and wrote a report on what happened. Why should that report be questioned?
First of all, it's shockingly simple, the narrative, and I think that's an indication that it was created for public consumption. It was basically that these, 19 terrorists, all conveniently fitting the mold of what we consider to be a terrorist looking person these days. They boarded a plane with box cutters, right? Were there any other weapons used? Not that I recall.
Not that I recall.
Nothing fancy. And they somehow commandeered these highly complicated jet airplanes, passenger planes, and they managed to crash them into a couple of buildings, and then whatever happened in Pennsylvania must have gone, that went wrong. They were heading towards where?
I think there was some speculation they might have been going toward the White House.
Yeah.
But once again, I think that's just speculation.
And that's pretty much it. The narrative continues that was enough to cause not one, not two, but 3 buildings to collapse essentially into their own footprints at a speed which is considered to be extremely close to free fall speed. And I guess when I started outlining this, I said it's extremely simple. Well, when you get into the physics of all that, it's anything but simple. In fact, it's impossibly complex, and I would say outright impossible that narrative could be true. And we can get into the details of all those things, and there are now dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of engineers, architects, professional people, scientists who have weighed in on the likelihood of 3 building collapses as a result of airplane collisions. And suffice it to say, the probability is not high that could happen, could ever happen. Now you might argue, and proponents of the official story do argue that, well, it was unlikely, but it obviously did happen, so we have to work from that as a starting point. Well, I can tell you personally, I did, with a small measure of suspicion, just because I was into some of these other topics before, and know that the government in its various agencies, especially the intelligence agencies, in the black budget arena, they operate with impunity. There's not a lot of oversight. So I'm suspicious anyway of the intelligence agency complex. And I was suspicious, but I have to admit I did buy into the story for several years, actually. And it wasn't until I saw a video of World Trade Center 7, or Building 7, and I saw it collapse straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance at free fall speed. And to me, that was stunning. I just could not believe it. And in our earlier discussion, you mentioned the Kingdome in Seattle. We're both obviously in the Pacific Northwest here, and we're treated to many videos of watching that giant circular Seattle Seahawks Kingdome drop to the ground in a controlled demolition. Well, of course, Building 7 looks like the classic controlled demolition. And when I started looking more into Building 7, that was and is the key, I believe, to cracking the whole, and you would probably agree, a conspiracy surrounding 9/11.
Well, the Building 7 thing is intriguing to me. I, for a long time, didn't know about that.
Mm-hmm.
And to my understanding, the facts that have come out, even I don't know to what extent that Building 7 was even mentioned. If it was mentioned, probably wasn't mentioned at all in the 9/11 Commission report, the official report. But the idea that a building that was not hit, allegedly not hit by any, could come down in a free fall, what appeared to be some kind of controlled demolition, that raises a question right there as to whether or not the investigation that took place about what happened in that day in New York City and Pennsylvania was a thorough investigation.
Well, I don't think it was even mentioned in the first investigation. In fact, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, was charged with the unenviable task of explaining all this in scientific terms. They didn't even issue their report on Building 7 until 2008. So they delayed for 7 years before they released information, their quote, definitive, unquote, report on how Building 7 came down in a free fall fashion, looking exactly like controlled demolition. And Building 7 was not hit by the airplanes, but it was hit by debris from one of the taller towers falling down in a highly asymmetrical fashion. And rather than supporting the idea that damage brought this thing down, straight down, I think that is actually evidence against the idea that the airplanes and their collateral damage could have brought this thing down in the manner that it dropped. Because it was asymmetrical, it was only on one side of the building, the major damage. If the building is weakened in one area, it's clearly not going to drop to the ground, with the top staying level the entire way through. It's going to tilt towards where the weakened structures are. And that's just, I mean, you don't have to be a physicist to understand that. It's just obvious that that's how it should have come down. And, to point out the fact that there's never been a building that has collapsed as a result of fire in this manner. Never before 2001 and never since 2001.
Which further leads to speculation about that official version as being
accurate. And we have many examples of fires raging throughout high-rise buildings, and for even up to 24 hours, and nothing like this is ever seen. And so the proponents of the official story are really, really far out on a limb, I think, scientifically, when they suggest that this is just a one-time happening that can be explained scientifically, because things that are highly unlikely don't happen by accident 3 times in the same day. You might have an unlikely thing happen. I mean, unlikely things happen all the time, but to have 3 buildings collapse to the ground in their own footprint on the same day, strains the imagination to think about how that could have happened.
I think Building 7 is obviously very important, but there's some precursors in my mind that start laying the foundation to talk about why Building 7 is important. In a previous lifetime, I worked in law enforcement, and one of the things that you learn, particularly about criminal acts, and whether this is an act of terrorism, which is what the people who allegedly committed the acts were labeled as, or it's a violation of the law, it's criminal, you do some kind of investigation to establish what went on. To me, it's significant, if you know the backstory about 9/11, that the administration of George Bush and Dick Cheney resisted any kind of investigation into these events. And as I recall, there was a statement made by Cheney that he didn't want any kind of investigation to interfere with the international war on terrorism, which had been declared against Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and any of their cohorts. So the fact that there was a resistance to an investigation of one of the most traumatic events in American history raised some flags for me. And a lot of what I'm talking about today comes from Jim Marrs's book, The Terror Conspiracy. And Marrs, I've read his book on the assassination of JFK and his book on the alien agenda, which is about the UFO phenomena. I think Jim Marrs is a very well-researched writer. So I give a lot of credence to what he talks about. But one of the things that comes out of this resistance to doing an investigation is the official investigation, which we're questioning, only comes about when 4 widows of people who died in the World Trade Center collapse put political pressure on Congress and the Bush administration to have an investigation. So it doesn't come about from the administration saying, oh, we really need to look into what this is all about and make sure that we're getting the right guys with Osama bin Laden and whatever. It's like somebody from the outside has the investigation. And then the famous story about the investigation is that the first person that was placed in position to head the investigation was Henry Kissinger. And then it became known that Henry Kissinger had clients that were from Saudi Arabia, and that of the odd number of hijackers that were alleged to be on those planes, most of them were Saudi Arabians.
Right.
So then it became politically uncomfortable to place Kissinger in that role. And then the story, and this is all in Marrs's book, is that Philip Zelikow, who was an administration individual within the Bush administration, then becomes the new chairperson, and he's the gatekeeper for the investigation, and then they get some people appointed from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to look into this. So to me there's kind of a suspicious notion here at the outset that the officials, the authorities, the administration didn't really want to look into this to begin with. Maybe because there would be uncomfortable questions like, why did Building 7 come down by itself when it wasn't hit by any planes? And then there's all these convoluted starts to the investigation, and it's almost like this Zelikow guy is put there because he wants a prearranged conclusion that maybe echoes Dick Cheney's idea that we don't want to have an investigation interfere with what we're doing, whether that be an international war on terrorism or a plan to invade Iraq to utilize its oil reserves. These things create all kinds of questions. And most investigations, from a law enforcement standpoint, when people give testimony, they're placed under oath. And when George Bush and Dick Cheney appeared before this commission, they appeared jointly, and neither of them were placed under oath. And that makes me wonder, I guess this whole thing is about questions that get raised. So even at the outset, before we have these conclusions of the 9/11 Commission, there are questions about why it gets going, how it gets going, if it gets going, and to what degree Bush and Cheney and that administration was interested in getting at the truth.
Well, and you brought up a good point, that this was a crime scene. It was not treated as a crime scene. It was the WTC-7, for example, the steel was illegally removed and destroyed. There was no coherent investigation of all the possibilities that could have led to this horrific scene. It was just, like we mentioned, within a day it was determined who did it, the war on terror was declared, and we went from there. And whether it was just extreme opportunism by Cheney and Bush and that administration to get moving on to what was next, which is clearly wars and the military-industrial complex vastly enriching itself, or it was a case of where we don't want anyone to look into this deeper because they'll find out that the official narrative is not true. Whatever the case, there was a crime scene, and the process was not followed that you would have expected from somebody who was genuinely interested in finding out what really happened and who was responsible. So yes, that brings up all sorts of questions about the people who are overseeing this scene and trying to get to the bottom of it. Well, clearly there were people who were not interested in getting any sort of narrative or explanation other than the one that we were essentially spoon-fed within the next day or two, and it's continued to this day. And Osama bin Laden was never even on the FBI wanted list. Probably heard that before.
Right.
For lack of evidence. He was never, there wasn't even enough evidence to tie him to the scene that would make him the boogeyman that he was, was made into almost immediately. And that raises all sorts of other questions. Why, if he was the guy and they knew so quickly, then why couldn't we have tried him in a court of law? And I know that gets to the whole terrorism versus just garden variety criminal, but there was no effort whatsoever to do anything except spew the typical lines that came from Bush and his administration about getting those who are responsible.
Evildoers.
The evildoers, what was his favorite line? But what was his?
Well, I mean, he had so many favorite lines. You're either for us or against us, which to me seems an awful simplistic approach.
Justice will be done. It's the whole white hat versus the black hat cowboy thing. There was no mention of this is America. We have a judicial system. We have ways that we do things, due process, and we're careful about, and we're hesitant to go into war, and we're aware of blowback, a concept that clearly they either had no concern about, or that was the whole plan from the beginning, was to get the Middle East riled up so that it's an ongoing war to feed the war machine and so on and so forth.
As I hear you talk, I'm reminded of during President Clinton's presidency, several supporters of the new conservative philosophy in the United States, which just happened to be some of the architects of the policy that we carried out in Iraq, wrote a letter to President Clinton talking about their concerns that America's status as a superpower was waning. Mm-hmm. And they said what would really be needed in order to energize Americans and to reinvigorate our foreign policy and our military to return ourselves to the strength that they felt was lacking was an event that would essentially be a new Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to be a conspiracy theorist, and just because something is labeled as a conspiracy doesn't mean that you should dismiss it, because conspiracy is a part of the criminal law. The event that could have effectively become the new Pearl Harbor could have been the attack on New York on 9/11. So, once again, this raises all kinds of questions about the official report that puts that in doubt. And I don't know that we're here tonight to talk about, well, we know exactly what happened, but maybe we are here to talk about that some uncomfortable questions are raised. So what else comes to mind that would cause you, besides Building 7, apparent controlled demolition? What other kinds of aspects of the events surrounding the official narrative of 9/11? What events are troublesome to you?
The one thing I'll mention that you brought up here, conspiracy, the idea of a conspiracy. Well, conspire is, what does conspire mean? Well, it means con and spire, which is related to breathing, con with, so breathing together, essentially getting together and telling secrets, holding secrets. There's nothing outrageous about suggesting people getting together and planning things. It's conspiring. People do it all the time. So it's a matter of, when you're trying to analyze something this really complicated, it's a matter of ruling things out. I mean, that's what science is about. A lot of people, when you bring up the, quote, conspiracy about 9/11, people say, okay, fine, things don't add up, but what's your explanation? There doesn't need to be an alternate explanation if you're behaving scientifically. You just need to rule things out. You rule one thing out after another, and eventually you come to the truth. So like you just said, we don't pretend that we're going to solve the mystery. Who's behind 9/11? What are the ulterior motives other than in a general sense? And the general sense, I think you and I can agree upon, is that this is really good for the war machine. It's really good for the military-industrial complex. It's really good for, frankly, fascism, which is best defined as the coming together of state and corporate interests. And we see a whole lot of that right now as this warrantless wiretapping NSA scandal spreads far and wide. We don't need to get into that, but that's an example of government getting together behind closed doors with corporate America and multinational corporations to essentially take away the citizenry's civil liberties. And 9/11 really opened up the door wide for that, unfortunately, for that course to be taken. So when I say that I think that 9/11 was a conspiracy, and I'm almost 100% certain of it. The reason I say that is that there is a lot of evidence, a lot of physical evidence, like Building 7. But, there's too much to really get into now. I would refer listeners to AE911truth.org. That's the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And as I mentioned, there are hundreds of professionals who have gone over the NIST reports and other government reports and claims regarding the official narrative, the official conspiracy theory. And it's been taken apart bit by bit. It can't, there's so many holes in it that, to be frank, you'd have to be a dullard to believe it, or an idiot. That word is not too strong. I personally believe you're not paying any attention if you believe the official narrative. And you mentioned the Jim Marrs book. I would also recommend David Ray Griffin's The New Pearl Harbor Revisited. Of course, he talks about what you just mentioned, which is that this really opened up a door for that particular group who's looking to jumpstart the war machine. And then Webster Tarpley's 9/11 Synthetic Terror. Those are some excellent resources, but if you want to go and start reading the NIST reports and the rebuttals from actual engineers and architects, I guarantee you will be convinced that the official narrative is just flat out impossible. So once you've ruled out the official narrative, you do move into other things, and that's when we get into Stephen Jones's, the BYU professor, his idea of nanothermite, the explosive charges having been planted in the building, and he suggested those would have been capable of bringing down the building in the fashion that they came down. Rapid onset of destruction, mid-air pulverization. I mean, a lot of people don't know that 180,000 tons of concrete virtually disappeared when World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2 came down. I mean, it turned into pyroclastic clouds like volcanoes.
Right, yeah, volcano.
The material was pulverized. Its composition was changed. We had high velocity ejections, like explosive charges sending girders flying at 50 miles per hour out of the building, that definitely cannot be explained by pancaking floors crashing on top of each other and shooting out air or whatever. I mean, some of those theories sound good on the surface, but when you actually look at the physics behind them as deconstructed by the professionals on, again, AE 9/11 Truth, for example, is one of the best ones, but there are several. There's like Journal of 9/11 Studies, 60 peer-reviewed papers there addressing all of these different things. I mean, you get into the evidence, and again, you have to start ruling things out. The official narrative is ruled out immediately. So I don't know what happened. The nanothermite idea is compelling to a certain extent, but I've also heard other competing theories that fit some of the other evidence. An EMP, electromagnetic pulse, mini nukes, and a host of other different theories about what could have brought the towers down.
Was
And again, we don't need to get specifically into those. It's just far too complicated for a show like ours today. But rest assured that there is a lot of evidence out there. You just have to go look at it and be diligent about reading it and comparing it to what the official narrative is.
even though I would agree with you that we don't want to get into the details, as you were talking, I just happened to be looking at page 55 of Jim Mars's book, and consistent with the alternative explanation for the destruction of the World Trade Center. I guess on that day at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Palisades, New York, which was 21 miles away from the World Trade Center, just prior to the collapse of the Twin Towers. Mars notes that these people recorded 2 seismic spikes, which would be almost like earthquake activity, I guess, maybe even volcanic activity, indicating large bursts of energy that shook the ground beneath the World Trade Center towers just before their collapse. So that's obviously an explanation or an event that could be tied to an explanation that has nothing to do with the planes crashing in the World Trade Center.
Well, there are all sorts of reports. Over 100 first responders, the heroes, the true heroes that went in, some of them lost their lives, but there are over 100 reports of explosions and flashes of light before the towers came down. And that's really, the list of evidence is much more consistent with an explosive event, not jet fuel igniting and dripping down the elevator shafts or whatever. The official story is now, what most people don't know about the official story also is that NIST never explained what happened. They were charged with one thing and one thing only, and that was to explain how the buildings collapsed due to a collision with the airplane. They weren't tasked with trying to figure out how else the buildings could have come down. They were told to figure out, okay, how do the airplanes make these things fall down? And so, as a result, they completely overlooked the idea of explosives planted in the building. They completely overlooked the whole idea of controlled demolition. And in fact, I think they devote a total of 1 paragraph, a few sentences, to the idea of controlled demolition. And they say, well, in order to get a building of that size to fall down, you would have had to put explosive devices on every girder, every supporting structure. And there was no way for anyone to get in there and do that, so therefore we can completely dismiss that. However, ironically, NIST, in their complicated computer models, which they didn't share with any outside party to be critiqued on them, they decided that it was in fact the collapse of only 1 column that led to a chain reaction, bringing the entire buildings down. So in one breath they're saying, well, you couldn't have had controlled demolition because it would have had to be on all the supporting structures. And then in the next breath they say, but they all fell down because the airplane damaged 1 supporting structure, and that was enough to initiate the entire collapse. But what they did was they modeled the events just up to the point of collapse, again using complicated computer simulations, which, as it turned out, were very flawed. And again, you can read what the engineers and the computer guys say about that. But they modeled it up to the point of collapse, and then they just said, good enough. That's the end. They didn't bother to say how the collapse proceeded, how it occurred. They just said, okay, here's where something starts. That led to everything else. So their scientific analysis was extremely suspect and flawed, and it was the action of a committee that was charged with an unenviable task of explaining the unexplainable with something that was politically acceptable.
Well, I think that's very significant that you mentioned that, Dave, because that brings me back to Philip Zelikow, who was the gatekeeper of information for the committee. There were even people, both the 2 chairmen of the committee, Lee Hamilton of Indiana and Thomas Keene, who I believe was a former governor, both had complaints about their access to all the information they needed during the investigation. But to me it would be consistent if you're going to limit the areas in which the investigation is allowed to go, the questions that are asked. If you're only interested in coming to some kind of a certain conclusion, then as a gatekeeper, somebody like Zelikow or anybody else who would be favorable to the administration's view of what would be going on, wouldn't want a far-ranging investigation. They'd want you to only look at things that would justify or validate the outcome that would, put them in the most favorable light, which once again just really makes you question what the 9/11 Commission came.
Well, that would be a very difficult task too. In some ways, I sort of feel sorry for these departments, agencies, these people who are put in charge of trying to manage this catastrophe that just think of the destruction that happened there. And they were charged again with saying that, well, a plane crashed the top floors, it spilled a bunch of jet fuel, most of which surely burned up rapidly. And you can see that by the very dark smoke that was billowing out of the buildings. Well, yeah, the airplane has a big tank, but for the things to cause the collapse of 3 buildings, one that wasn't even hit by an airplane, of course, which is why they ignored that for 7 years. But to initiate this fantasy that NIST painted for us with just jet fuel it's almost an impossible task. And there are, of course, other suspicious things like the fully intact passport that was found in the middle of the street of one of the alleged hijackers. Somehow 3 buildings go crumbling to the ground, pulverized, but the hijacker's passport flutters, untouched into the streets where some FBI guy can pick it up and go, hey, well,
look,
wasn't
here's
that
proof
lucky?
of what happened, yeah.
Here's one of those hijackers, and hey, here's his box cutter, his box cutting knife right here with his fingerprints on it. Isn't that convenient? Well, and just a couple weeks ago, they found part of an engine wedged. Did you hear about that? In an alley somewhere.
I believe I did hear about that.
Like 12 years later, there's an engine. What would you bet that it has the right serial number on it? Even though for years we haven't had more than a tiny handful of airplane parts that matched the alleged airplanes.
Well, and that brings up, when we're talking about airplane parts, one of the crashes that we haven't talked too much about has been what happened at the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. And what's often bothered me about that narrative was that supposedly this 757 crashes into the Pentagon, this giant gaping hole, and it does so to a building, the Pentagon, in Washington, D.C., because it's the capital of the United States, which seems to be pretty well protected by all kinds of missile batteries. So you wonder to what extent, so these would be some of the questions. To what extent is a rogue airplane, which this flight was identified as being, to what extent is that allowed to kind of move unencumbered throughout the skies when there was no evidence that, for instance, I think Andrews Air Force Base is like 12 miles away from the Pentagon. No jets were ever scrambled, according to Mars's book. No jets were ever scrambled to intercept that plane that crashed in the Pentagon. And if there were missile batteries in position, and this was known to be a threat to security of the United States or the Pentagon, why don't those missile batteries come into play? And then the most obvious kind of thing is that when a plane crashes, there have been a lot of comment about the inconsistency with the footprint left by this plane, a gigantic 757 with jet engine, that when you saw pictures after the crash, you didn't see the fuselage of the plane. You didn't see the engines, strewn about on the grounds of the Pentagon. So it's like, well, this narrative of a plane crashing into the Pentagon doesn't necessarily fit with what we know about how the Pentagon can be defended, how air interceptors could be sent to have stopped the plane before it got there, and then certainly what would have happened in terms of the wreckage being left outside of the Pentagon and inside the Pentagon that would be proof that there was a 757 that actually crashed in there. So once again, okay, here's the narrative, but the details that go with it just don't necessarily.
Plus all the security cameras that you would think would have caught. That we've got one 2-second clip of the supposed plane going into the Pentagon. Out of all the security cameras, even the independent businesses with security cameras, you would think that would have been filmed at some point, but yet either all the possible videos of the event have been confiscated, and there's some reports that that's actually what happened, or what we're told happened didn't actually happen. I have to admit, I'm an agnostic on the Pentagon event. I mean, I've seen videos of jet planes crashing into a wall tests, and they essentially vaporize I mean, there's not much left of them. So I can envision that having been a plane. However, there's so many other inconsistencies that I could see it having been a missile. The eyewitness reports vary widely. I mean, you'd think if it was an airplane, everyone would just say, oh, obviously it was an airplane crashing into the Pentagon, but the eyewitness testimony is very confusing regarding all of that. So, like I said, I'm an agnostic on that. I haven't made up my mind on that, but I do know, and you mentioned the very key point, that where were all our defenses? Well, our defenses there was a massive and total failure of our defense mechanism throughout that day, which is completely inexplicable except by the fact that we had simultaneous up to 40 some war game exercises occurring at precisely the moment of the attack on the World Trade Center, which is an extreme coincidence if you believe in coincidences. But what it looks like is a classic intelligence tactic to confuse the protective powers in place into delaying, and that's what happened. NORAD, like you said, jets were not scrambled in time because they were confused. They didn't know if it was an exercise. They didn't know what was really happening, and so the commanders were hesitant to scramble jets and use the resources if it wasn't actually a real event. Well, unfortunately, it turned out to be a real event, but there were at least dozens of exercises that were going on, and again, you can look in Tarpley's 9/11 Synthetic Terror to see the actual transcripts of the pilots and the air control centers, and it's just absolute chaos because they don't know what's happening. There was Vigilant Warrior going on, Northern Vigilance, Northern Guardian, the NRO drill, National Reconnaissance Office, which is one of the most secretive agencies on the planet, so secret that we don't really know what it does. They have something to do with spy satellites. But they were running a drill. Tripod 2. I mean, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on that precise moment that guaranteed utter confusion, and it gave the window for such a thing to be pulled off. And that brings up the question that people always go to next, which is, did they make it happen on purpose, or did they let it happen on purpose? Mm-hmm. So it's the my-hop versus the lie-hop hypothesis. To me, that isn't the most important question. The fact is that it happened, and I want to find out how it happened. I don't pretend to know the players behind the scene. I mean, I don't know that anyone can find that out when you're talking deep intelligence agencies and black budgets and all that. I think it was probably a made it happen, though. I mean, it was probably a combination of, yes, there are some bad guys who wanted to do something, so they were coddled along the way, and they were said, hey, do you want to be part of this big thing to get back at America? And I think they thought they were involved in something. I don't know that the alleged hijackers, though, knew that they were going to be flown into a building and vaporized. And by their actions the night before, you can see accounts of that, they didn't act like people who were, knowingly going into their deaths as martyrs. And there's a whole narrative regarding the alleged hijackers and their bumbling nature, their incompetence, the near impossibility that they could actually pull this off. Technically, flying, there's a whole other thing that we can get into. I recommend the books, of course, though, for details on those issues. But was it a let it happen or a made it happen? I think given the PNAC stuff, the need for a new Pearl Harbor, the constant pressure of the military-industrial complex, the war machine, I think they really, really needed something to happen. And I think they had a big hand in making it happen sooner rather than later, and this presented a great opportunity to start the ball rolling to where we are today. And maybe that might be a good segue into what we see today as a result of 9/11.
Right, and one of the things that is relevant to that is the Patriot Act, mm-hmm. Which passed, I believe, in the Senate 93-1, with only Russ Feingold from Wisconsin later defeated for re-election, mm-hmm. voting against that. The Patriot Act has essentially, in my view, modified the Constitution of the United States, particularly the Fourth Amendment, where no longer is the government required to operate off of the legal standard of probable cause, which has to be proven before a judge, before a search, a subsequent search, and in cases of evidence of wrongdoing, a seizure of that evidence would be required. Now it's like if someone gets labeled a terrorist or a possible terrorist, it's like the Fourth Amendment isn't even relevant anymore. And I think that's what's led to the recent revelations about the domestic spying, the National Security Agency using Verizon, a phone company, and other cell phone providers, and maybe internet providers as a means to collect information about the American citizen, regardless of whether or not there's any indication anybody's doing anything wrong. And that's very troubling to me, because that's this constant argument that you have in things like these days, as well as it better to be more secure and have less civil liberties, or have more civil liberties and be very less secure. I'm just a person who doesn't believe that it's warranted. Your security warrants the loss of your civil liberty. And I think there have been instances
Well, that even implies that you're gaining security by giving up your right. I don't buy the argument that sweeping up 10 trillion bits of information, or whatever the NSA reported they've received, will keep you safe. If anything, it just increases the chances of having garbage information that you waste your time on wading through, instead of doing the proper things to actually protect us. So that's kind of a fallacy in itself, I believe, the idea that just give up a little more liberty and you will be more secure. So anyway, I interrupted you there, but...
Oh no, I think that's a great point. And I'm reminded that, I can't remember what the name of the book was, but Tom Ridge used to be governor of Pennsylvania.
Homeland Security?
He was the first Homeland Security chief. And I think in his book, he came right out and said during the 2004 election between Bush and John Kerry, the Democrat, that the Bush administration encouraged Ridge, as chairman of the head of the Secretary of Homeland Security, to constantly keep there was like that Christmas tree colored, danger, no danger, danger, kind of like a Christmas
danger,
tree.
Will Robinson.
Yeah, that Lost in Space kind of thing.
It was orange or red.
Right. And it was never green.
If it was only yellow, you'd just be a little bit scared and paranoid. If it was orange or red, then you just go out of your head with, just freak out. That's fine. We'll protect you.
And it was obvious what Ridge was saying in that book was that Bush was encouraging that level, that terrorist threat level, to be at its high or higher rate, just because it would benefit him politically, because people would tend to want to vote, stay with the known entity, the Bush administration, rather than John Kerry. So, I mean, that's an outcome. I think the Patriot Act and this assault on civil liberties that we're facing now, this is an outcome of the 9/11 event, and it does raise some serious questions about whether or not we do have the constitutional rights that we are promised as American citizens, and whether or not we're more secure because of the loss of these civil liberties. And if you assume, going back to your let it happen or make it happen kind of thing, if you assume that either one of those scenarios, to me, would be true, then I think that really says something about how much danger we are in this country, becoming very autocratic, very Orwellian kind of
fascism. Again, you mentioned it's the merger. I mean, the most accurate definition of fascism is not taking my guns away, or, that a libertarian would argue. It's the merger of state and corporate interests such that it's a private corporation, which is essentially a kingdom. I mean, my wife and I own a veterinary hospital. We're the king and queen of the hospital. What we say goes. You basically have no rights as an employee. You certainly can't, unlike with Congress, or we're here in Olympia, where the capital of the state, where our Washington State representatives hang out. You can go camp out on the lawn there, and you're not going to get thrown in jail. But if you go to Eric Schmidt or whoever, Mark Zuckerberg's house, and you camp out on his lawn, you'll be gone in 10 minutes in handcuffs. So do you want corporations merging with intelligence agencies to determine in secret the laws that they use to justify blowing you up with a missile from a drone that's hovering over your house? I mean, that is the point as ridiculous as it sounds and would have sounded 20 years ago, that's the point where we are. We have secret courts making laws that they can't tell us about, and they can't tell us how they came to those conclusions because they're hiding behind the catch-all phrase, oh, it's national security. But we have to abide by those laws that they make in secret. And that's what's come about as a result, not to mention the 10 wars that we're currently fighting under the Obama administration in various, and we occupy 100 countries with our military forces. I mean, it's completely out of control, and I think that was the purpose. So you're right, let it happen, make it happen. The result is the same. It's a move towards fascism and a highly military-based society where our rights get eroded practically on a daily basis.
I think that's the real relevance of 9/11. I mean, it's not just an event that's part of American history and we're asking some kind of questions to try to get at the truth. It's that event has been used to alter life in the United States in a way that I don't think a lot of people would say has been a positive way. It's been more of a totalitarian approach to things than one that emphasizes democracy. One of the things I wanted to do here, and we're kind of trying to stay out of our usual paranormal type of venue here, but I thought that it would be interesting to at least take a look at something that Jim Marrs did in his book. Mm-hmm. And one of the things he did was, a lot of things, but one of the things he did was he convened a bunch of remote viewing. And if you know what remote viewing is, it's essentially psychic spying where people are given some kind of coordinates and sometimes they're asked to view what's going on in a particular situation. Sometimes they're trying to find people, locations of people who might be important to know where their locations are. A lot of people have dismissed psychic spying or remote viewing, but I think it's kind of interesting that the United States military had that program in place for 20 years and spent billions of dollars on it, so if it's totally a fallacy,
Well, the FBI, I know, had an entire program where they concluded, and there's a really interesting quote you can Google, I'm sure, FBI and psychics or psychic program, where they concluded that only a small percentage of people proved to be exceptionally psychic, basically. They said, yes, we found a small percentage who were scientifically, it was unexplainable how accurate they were. It was highly improbable. And they concluded that there was a small handful of psychics that actually could do what they purported to be able to do. But then they added the standard skeptic clause that the skeptics all jumped upon later, and they said, but it's really not enough that we are going to pursue the program.
But once again, I think it's interesting that having said that, they continued the program for 20 years.
Yeah. Well, what they were saying is that we're going to take it black now that we spent the public funds or the whatever. Now that we've found the information that we needed, we're going to take it black and we're really going to use it. So anyway, that's kind of the background for the remote viewing. Right. There is some science behind it, for sure.
So here's what Jim Marrs was able to come up with. These are questions posed to 12 people who had previously been involved in remote viewing programs of the military, and even there's two of those people, excuse me, that have been identified in this book. So I'm just going to read several. There's about 10 questions. I won't read all of them, but give you a sense of some of the answers that the remote viewers came up with. And once again, we're not saying that this is the true version of what happened on 9/11, but I think the answers certainly raised the skepticism once again about the official version. So the one that I was most interested in, did George, and this goes back to make it happen versus let it happen, did President George Bush have foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks? And I almost expected that answer to be yes, because of just my feeling about who Bush is and the context that he came into power and the people who support him. Well, I was disappointed because the remote viewer said no. But significantly, did George H.W. Bush, which would be George Bush's father, have foreknowledge of 9/11 attacks? Their consensus answer was yes. Did Dick Cheney have foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks? Their consensus answer was yes. Did Osama bin Laden have foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks? Their consensus answer was yes. And probably the most The last two questions I think have some special significance in kind of a negative way and further add fuel to the fire, not jet fuel necessarily. Were the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center controlled from the plane's cockpits? The consensus answer was no. So that kind of destroys this idea that there were a bunch of Saudi Arabians and Egyptians piloting those planes going into the World Trade Center. And finally, was any U.S. intelligence involved in the 9/11 attack? Yes, which certainly is consistent with the let it happen or make it happen. Anyway, I think that to whatever degree you subscribe to remote viewing, that's...
I think even without the remote viewers' input, do have to come to the same answers that they provided merely by looking at the totality of the evidence. Clearly there was motive from Cheney and his group. Bush, I think we all got the feeling that he was just in it for the ride. He wasn't really part of the club.
He was too busy reading My Pet Goat.
Well, yeah, his reaction to the news of the towers going down was that of someone who just got blindsided, like, oh, why didn't someone tell me about that? Or he heard rumors of it, or someone said, well, George, something big's going down. It's not something you need to worry about. You just keep clearing brush from your ranch or whatever, playing golf or something, and
working hard.
Work hard and act like a president from Texas would. He had that routine down pretty good. But clearly, whoever had input and control of the military exercises had some knowledge, and somebody had access to the building. And I know there's some evidence that it was Bush's Jeb. I can't remember which, or Marvin. Is it Marvin Bush?
And I think one of Bush's brothers had a company that was in charge of security.
Mm-hmm. And they had access to the elevator shafts, right. And there was actually a period where things were shut down supposedly for maintenance, which would have provided a good window of opportunity there to put some thermite charges in select places or whatever. Again, getting into the area where it's pretty hard to ever get to the truth, unfortunately, because the evidence has been cleaned up and recycled. The steel mostly shipped to China or elsewhere. So let it happen, made it happen. Who did it? Who knew about it? Those are some huge questions. I don't know if we'll ever get an answer.
But questions I think that need to be asked and that need to, because of some of the things we refer to that's going on in contemporary United States, I think these kind of inquiries are important.
Well, the authorization to use military force, which sent us to Iraq, right? That thing still lives, I believe. It's still been relied upon to invade other countries. And we just have to say the word terror in order to get the American people, unfortunately, to step back and allow yet more power to be taken from them, or more to weaken the Constitution just a bit more, what fragments are left of it. And that is a really scary result of the whole event.
Because it's really hard in the time we have these Anomalies podcasts to cover in depth this 9/11 event and what we think about the official version and what we think are some of the alternatives to that official version. Let's go ahead and maybe reaffirm for our listeners these books that we have, so they can go ahead and, if they want to, investigate these questions in more depth. The primary book that I use some of my material for tonight's broadcast is The Terror Conspiracy, subtitled Deception, 9/11 and the Loss of Liberty. It's by investigative journalist Jim Marrs, M-A-R-R-S. That's highly recommended.
And I recommend that book also as well. The two Griffins, I confuse them because they both have that unusual name in their full name. Webster Griffin Tarpley, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, which really gets into some areas that you won't find in other books. Really intriguing. Tarpley is just an amazing, he's an economist, but he's an amazing store of information, and he's a very reliable source of rather obscure information. He leaves no stone unturned, so that's a great one. And then David Ray Griffin, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, 9/11, The Cover-Up, and The Expose. So they go into the different versions of Let It Happen, Made It Happen. They talk about, the potential players behind the scene, those who could have benefited from the event, those who would have liked to make it happen, those who may have made it happen, and a lot of the details also about the inconsistencies in the official story. And again, I can't recommend highly enough the AE911truth.org. Again, if you're looking for science and details and arguments and logic, that is the place to go. I guarantee you go there and you read through their stuff, it blows apart the official story like no other source that I've read.
So maybe we'll end up by this quote. This is a quote from Jim Marrs' book. He quotes the Roman poet Juvenal, and these words very relevant to tonight's podcast of Anomalies. The quote is simply, "Who will guard the guards?" Dave, thanks for another enjoyable Anomalies podcast. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks.